Hi, this is Kate from Generate Magic, and I actually want to follow up with my last video because, as usual, after I posted it, I found myself wanting to say more. And so it's specifically on this notion of forgiveness. And it's probably a little bit different than the way you typically hear about forgiveness talked about. And so in A Course in Miracles, forgiveness is just forgiving yourself for making an error in perception. And this error is essentially choosing to see something through the lens of lack rather than the lens of love. Or another way of putting it is choosing to see something in an unloving way. And so it's probably kind of a lot of these concepts, right, in A Course in Miracles, they seem pretty out there and maybe even a little bit crazy if you're not really familiar with the text. And it really is kind of something that you have to experience for yourself, but at the same time, it's one of those things where people say this a lot, that when you discover it, basically you know that you're ready for it. And this concept of forgiveness had never really sat quite right with me. And obviously it's better than the opposite, which is resentment, bitterness, and just kind of, just holding a grudge against somebody. But at the same time, there was always kind of like this element of judgment and sort of like self-righteousness, like, oh, I'm going to get up on my high horse, and even though you did something really terrible, I'm going to be the higher person and I'm going to forgive you for it. And so it had that sort of energy to it for me. And then at the same time, it's also sort of like mixing an energy of judgment towards yourself as well, because I know for many times for me, like for instance the thing that I talked about in the last video, where I knew that I shouldn't keep stewing over this thing, that I knew I should just let it go, but for some reason I couldn't. And I kept telling myself, oh well, I should just forgive them. And I'm sure you've experienced this as well, right? Where for some reason you just couldn't let something go. And you kept telling yourself, well, why can't I just forgive the other person? And so there's sort of like an element of self-judgment tied into it as well. And again, this is a very radical notion, but it's this whole idea in A Course in Miracles that really there's nothing to forgive. It's kind of opening you up to the possibility of what if there was never a transgression in the first place. So it's really getting you to see it through a new perspective. And so again, it sounds very radical, but I think sometimes a radical way of thinking is required for a radical transformation, for us to really make those big shifts. And it's also just kind of like opening you up to new possibilities, right? It's kind of opening you up to this what if. And I really like just doing thought experiments because it really kind of keeps your mind agile, and it kind of gets you out of this sort of like rigid and dogmatic way of thinking. And so now I kind of regularly ask myself, whenever I find myself falling into that way of thinking, what if there was another way of looking at this? And what if whatever this quote-unquote terrible thing that somebody did to you, what if it was actually working in your favor the entire time? And in almost every single situation, I can kind of see how it was working in my favor. And so, for instance, with a past relationship that I had that was just very tumultuous, and he would say all sorts of quote-unquote terrible things, like he would tell me that I was the worst thing that had ever happened to him, that I had ruined his life. He would tell me how miserable that I made him. And so from one way of looking at it, you can kind of think, oh well, this was a really horrible person, what he did to me was really terrible. But then at the same time, I can kind of see, like, well, maybe he wasn't really doing anything that wrong. At any given time, I could have left the situation, right? I could have left this relationship, and for some reason I was choosing to stay in it, so obviously I was getting something out of it as well. And sometimes he kind of had a strange sense of humor, but then again, so do I. And so sometimes he would even joke about, he would say, well, maybe I just have Stockholm syndrome. And of course I would deny this, because who wants to admit to something like that? But then afterwards I realized, honestly, even at the time, I realized that he was right. I just didn't want to admit it. But I was very much a prisoner, but it was a prisoner of my own making. And I was choosing to be a prisoner instead of just stepping free of the situation. And there are a lot of reasons that I chose to stay in the situation. That itself could be its own video. But essentially, I'm very grateful for this whole situation, because it showed me the value of freedom. And basically nothing, I'm at a point where I'm pretty imperturbable, like almost nothing can get to me, nothing anybody can say to me. All in society, right, we're always hearing all these, it almost feels like a commandment, right? We always hear all these opinions on what we should be doing in order to be more spiritual, in order to be a good parent, in order to be a good person. And we're just always hearing all these shoulds. And it's very tempting to try and cater to these things, and to try and take it on, right? And to say, oh, well, maybe I've been doing it wrong this whole time. And instead of really just kind of examining it and saying, well, is this really true for me? And realizing that if it doesn't jive with you, you don't have to listen to it, right? You don't have to cater to it. And it's a very freeing feeling once you recognize this. So going back to the notion of forgiveness, right? That's when I realized that there was really nothing to forgive, because that whole experience with that relationship really got me to this level of freedom. It really kind of taught me what freedom really is, and that we're never truly a prisoner, and that at any given time we can choose to write a new script for ourselves, right? We can choose to quit playing our role in that dynamic. And so again, going back to the notion of forgiveness, and I would challenge you, anytime that you feel angry or resentful about a situation, just asking yourself, well, what did I gain from that situation? And so I look back at my parents, at all these things in childhood that they told me that I thought were so terrible, and that I sometimes like to blame, for all my insecurities. But then I kind of look back at it, and I see it, through a different light. And there's so many different angles, better angles to look at it through, that are kind of more loving and more empowering. I can kind of see one way of looking at it, right, is whenever somebody, whether it's in this case my parents or my ex-boyfriend or that person in your life, when somebody tells you something that sounds very harsh, a lot of times it's just kind of coming from their own insecurity, right? Or maybe they're just trying to protect you. And so it's very rare that a person is deliberately trying to hurt you. And if they are deliberately trying to hurt you, it comes from their own pain, right? And so that's one way of looking at it. But then even going beyond that, just kind of looking at how I benefited, every single thing that I experienced led me to a new level of awareness, a new level of expansion. And I wouldn't be the person that I am today with this level of awareness that I have today if it were not for all those past experiences. And so I really kind of see all those past experiences through as kind of a cumulative effect, right? And it's all like part of this larger tapestry that's informing my current reality. And I'm also like a writer, and so when I look back to things that like childhood bullies might have said to me, it always like makes very good writing material. And it allows me to to connect or more deeply empathize with other people who have been through the same experience. And so in summary, just kind of always ask yourself, is there truly anything to forgive? Was there ever really a transgression? And is there really anything to apologize for? And just challenging yourself to see it from a new perspective. And remembering that the only true error is basically the error in perception. And even the word error, I want to kind of challenge you to think of it in a new way. And so back when I was a high school teacher, and I would hand an English teacher, and I would hand back these rough drafts that would be all full of red marks. And students would get really upset. They would say, oh, well, I must have done really terrible. I'm like, no, it's like an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for correction. And so, and there's this other quote I mentioned before. I think it was Maxwell Maltz, maybe it was somebody else, but there is no failure, only feedback. And so every given moment, right, is an opportunity to, for correction, right? An opportunity to be more of that love that we truly are. And so with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your beautiful comments, and have a wonderful day.